Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar for the Pensions Dashboards programme that supports our consultation on the draft standards for the Pensions Dashboards ecosystem. Delighted to have you all here. I can see there's a really good turnout again. I'll do a quick round of introductions for the speakers for today. So some of you will remember me from the last webinar. My name is Richard James and I'm the Programme Director for the Pensions Dashboards Programme within the Money and Pensions Service. I am joined today by James Reardon, who is our Head of Technology within the programme, and Gary Miller, who has been working very hard on all of these standards as well. And they will be talking you through some key aspects of the standards as we go through today's webinar session. I'll give you a quick sense of what we're going to be covering today. You'll recall that this is the second of three of these webinars, and the last one we gave you a bit of an overview of the approach to the consultation and sort of oriented you to the content of the standards. Today we're starting to get into a little bit more of the detail of what is in those standards. I'll give you this quick overview first, then we'll go on to talk about the code of connection, the technical standards, the connection process and guidance, and specifically we will look a bit at the early connection guidance as well. Once again, we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the session, so please do take full advantage of that. You will see there is a questions box for you to capture any questions that you would like us to answer. As with the last one, we will get through all of those if we can. Hopefully we'll manage to get through all of those, but any we don't, we'll make sure we get answers out following the webinar. And once again, we'll be recording this webinar and we'll publish that recording on the website so that you can refer back to it, and anybody who couldn't make it today can also have a chance to have a look at it. So let's have a look in a bit more detail at the specific content for today. As I mentioned, this is the second webinar out of three, and that is in support of our consultation on the draft standards and guidance. As I said, in the last one, we gave you an overview of the standards, the approach to consultation, and our proposed approach to governance of the standards as well. Today, a little bit different. We will be focusing on connecting to the ecosystem and the standards and guidance that pension providers and dashboard providers will need to follow in order to be able to connect. So specifically, that's going to cover the code of connection, which consists of the security, the service, and the operational standards around the dashboards ecosystem. The technical standards as well, the connection process and guidance for pension providers, and our guidance for early connection, which we know some of you will be likely to be interested in. The goal of today is to take you through what those are and what's in them. Again, just to help orientate you around that, let you know what sits where, and particularly to get you thinking about who in your organisation you might need to get engaging with and reading each of those documents as well. So it's not going to be, you'll be pleased to hear, I'm sure, a detailed page turn exercise or a detailed explanation of each proposed requirement within those standards. Rather, we want to give you a helpful overview of the draft documents, help orientate you to them, understand the context and get a sense of what's where, really to help you with your response to the consultation exercise. As I said earlier, we will have a question and answer session at the end to provide any further explanation, context, or other information to help you engage with materials and respond to that consultation. And of course, we will be listening to the feedback that you give us during that question and answer session as well to help inform the further development of those standards and guidance. So, you know, everything we hear today, as well as your consultation responses, helps to inform where we go next on all of this. We will be making sure we prioritise those questions that relate to explaining the consultation to help you to respond. I know some of you might want to get into some of the really detailed content of those standards. That's not the primary purpose of today, although we will give you answers on that if we can and if we have time. But the biggest priority will be making sure that we get anything that helps you to respond to the consultation addressed. And again, we will publish those questions and answers after the webinar. Finally, from me, just another reminder that the documents we published so far are all drafts for consultation, so this is not final material. Those requirements and policy positions will probably evolve in response to what we hear from you during this consultation exercise, so it is all simply proposals at this stage. So that's all I wanted to do to introduce you to today's exercise. We will move on now to start talking through some of the content, and I will hand you over to James Reardon, who will start taking you through the code of connection and then on through the technical standards as well. James, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. Apologies, I'm just trying to get my camera working. It's a bit like me on a Monday morning, a bit slow to respond. Okay. It says it's starting, so what I'll do is I'll get started and hopefully you will see my face at some point, and I apologize if it frightens anyone. So I'll start taking you through the code of connection. So the code of connection combines 3 sets of standards that all parties connecting to the ecosystem, so that's both dashboards and pension providers. And when we use the term pension providers, obviously we are talking about either the pension scheme or a third-party organization such as an ISP or third-party administrator who's acting on their behalf. And these standards are all put into a single document which contains the security standards, which are the ongoing technical and procedural requirements to ensure security of the ecosystem. This is obviously in order to protect your data, the user's data, and ensure all parties can trust that the ecosystem is secure. Next is the service standards, and these are a minimum service requirements and other required behavior of participants to deliver a well-functioning and effective service. This ensures all parties are operating at the same level so that we know what to expect from each other and ensure that all of our users have a positive user experience. And then lastly, the operational standards. And these are the minimum operational business processes that participants must follow to support effective management and operation of the ecosystem. All parties seeking to connect to the ecosystem must comply with these requirements to connect, and they must continue to comply in order to remain connected to the ecosystem. And these standards are provided to provide assurance that the systems of all participants within the ecosystem which access and use our central digital architecture and interoperate with other ecosystem participants, that they are all managed and controlled to the appropriate levels. And these standards work together to ensure that the ecosystem provides a secure, well-functioning and effective service, which can garner consumer trust and satisfaction. And the draft code of connection sets out our proposals for what these requirements should be. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. So the first one we're looking at is the security standards. So these are baseline security controls that are recommended by NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre. We and our suppliers should implement these security controls. They apply also to all connecting parties, and they ensure that the ecosystem has the appropriate level of security. So these comprise of technical security requirements for the encryption of data when sent across the network and when stored, procedural requirements to ensure that all ecosystem connections are robustly tested for security vulnerabilities, so that's penetration testing or ethical hacking, and this is carried out by an independent third-party expert in cybersecurity, which has the CREST accreditation, and this is to check that the interface and to identify and address any exploitable security issues. So in terms of technical requirements, what we require is TLS version 1.2, so that's Transport Layer Security version 1.2 or above, and we will also have a mutual TLS connection, and also we require AES 256 encryption to all of those communications. And then similarly with the security testing requirements, as I already mentioned, you will require a IT health check by a CREST accredited supplier, and that will be an annual IT health check. And this health check should show no medium or high vulnerabilities, and we'll expect to see a plan to address any minor vulnerabilities that have been identified. Next up, we have the service standards. So these comprise of the technical service standards for service availability and transaction response times. So some examples of these are the time permitted for responses to acknowledge receipt of find requests. So when a user sends out a find request, there's a time limit required in order for you to acknowledge a response to that, and the time that we are suggesting is under a second. Time permitted to complete the matching in response to a find request, so that is taking the data and matching it against your records. We've suggested under 60 seconds. Time permitted to return view data in response to a view request. So that's when a dashboard sends a request to view the data that you hold for a pension owner. That's under 2 seconds. And lastly, we have a general service availability suggested uptime, which is 99.5%. So that would be 0.5% unscheduled downtime, not scheduled downtime, which obviously you can also have. So next, then we have the procedural service requirements. So examples of this are requiring behavior for registering pension identifiers and deregistering pension identifiers. So for example, when a possible match is resolved to not be a match, or when a relevant member ceases to be a relevant member. And also requirements for communicating connection outages and issues. And the requirements that we have for notifying PDP of connection outages is a minimum of 5 days in advance notice for any scheduled downtime, and a minimum of 5 days after any unscheduled downtime. We can move on to operational standards. So these are required operations and processes for onboarding and business as usual operation within the ecosystem once connected. And these cover the contact details needed for your organization or the organization that's connecting on your behalf, if you're connecting via a third party. Also the processes you'll need to follow to connect to the ecosystem, and the processes you'll need to have in place to deal with any service level failures, for escalating any issues, for things like dispute management and resolution, and for raising issues as well. And further details for these processes are still in development, and we'll confirm these in due course. So if we can move on, thank you. So what are we looking from the consultation? In particular, we're asking respondents to our consultation to give us feedback on some of the following areas in relation to the code of connection. So, do any of the proposed requirements pose a specific problem for your organization? And if so, what? Are there any areas that you consider are missing from our code of connection? And do the proposed service levels seem reasonable for a digital service? So on to the technical standards. So what's in the technical standards? This document contains a technical overview of the ecosystem, of how the ecosystem operates, and the technical requirements dashboards and pension providers will meet in order to operate within it. It also contains the connection mechanisms, so the API standards and the access management protocol to be used, which is UMA, and also the required methodology for the generation of tokens and identifiers required to make the service work. So this applies to all parties connecting to the ecosystem, both dashboards and pension providers, or the third parties that are connecting on behalf of those. So again, in terms of the technical standards, the things that we're looking for in particular, we'd like respondents to the consultation to give us feedback on some of the following areas. Do any of the proposed requirements pose a specific challenge for your organization? Are there any areas where further detail is needed? And is there any more guidance you need in relation to these requirements? So now we move on to the connection process and guidance. So this sets out the processes for connecting into the ecosystem that all parties will need to follow, and it explains what dashboards and pension providers should expect when connecting, the steps they'll have to take, and it provides guidance on the likely duration of each step. This is intended as a complement to the Code of Connection, which contains the standards that must be met to connect and to remain connected. And the draft legislation requires pension providers to have regard to this guidance when they connect. One point to highlight is that MAPS cannot guarantee to grant first preferences for specific connection dates. So pension providers will need to connect by their staging deadline, which will be set out in the legislation, and within a connection window. But we will have to manage connections according to our capacity and to the demand. So pension providers will need to take this into account in their planning. So this document sets out the two options facing pension providers who will be compelled by legislation to connect. The first option is to connect directly, which would involve building their own interface into the ecosystem, in which case you would need to follow every step in the connection process set out in the document. Or you will need to connect via a third party, in which case most of the steps will have already been taken and you'll just need to register with MAPS as a pension provider associated with that connection. We provide guidance on timings. If you are setting up a new direct connection, the complete process we would expect to take 6 to 9 months in total. That's being quite prudent. However, we should make clear that this is a significant undertaking, and we would encourage pension providers considering this to contact us early to register interest. And that 6 to 9 months encompasses the entire build, registering as a data provider, testing, service acceptance, and transition to live process. And obviously, it is possible to go quicker. Connecting via a third party should take no more than a week, although we advise you to allow around 30 days. And that requires registering as a data provider, onboarding, service acceptance, and requesting to go live and transition to live. And if we could move on to the next slide, please. So if you are registering via a third party, you'll be registering as a pension provider associated with the connected endpoint and providing the necessary pension provider information. You'll be confirming the third party's IT health check still holds, and you'll submit operational change requests to link the pension provider to the endpoint. So the consultation questions we have in regard to this document are: do the proposed steps for connecting to the dashboard's ecosystem directly seem reasonable? And also, do the proposed steps for connecting to the dashboard's ecosystem via a third-party connection seem reasonable? Also, does the proposed time frame for completing these steps to connect seem reasonable? As I said, we've tried to be quite prudent on these timelines. However, we would appreciate a response on that. Also, is it clear what pension providers or their third-party integrated service providers or dashboard providers will need to do to connect? And lastly, is there any additional guidance you feel you would need in relation to connection? And if so, what? So I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Gary Miller now, who will take you through the early connection guidance. Thank you.
Thanks, James. That was great. An awful lot of content to get through there. And just to remind people that whilst you have the opportunity to ask us questions, do send them in. And it's really, as Richard said earlier on, it's questions that we're looking for are those that help people be able to respond to the consultation itself as well. So moving on to my subject, it's the final substantive bit that we're going to cover today, and this relates to early connection and what it is and what our approach is. So this first slide is detailing what it is, and then go on and sort of talk about our approach in the next slide. This applies to occupational pension schemes that have both staging dates and those who don't. So those with more than 100 relevant members and those who don't. And if they want to connect to the ecosystem earlier than that staging date, if you've got 100 plus members, or if you don't have a staging date because you've got less than 100 relevant members, you want to connect early. And we think that this is advantageous for administrators who might want to connect their book in one bulk application as well. So as I said, it applies to occupational pension schemes under DWP's regulations, but there's going to be something similar for personal pension schemes under the FCA rules, and we'll see the detail of that in due course. So really our position, we start from is what we want to encourage onboarding. We want to be facilitative and to help be efficient. And if it's efficient to help a number of schemes with an administrator, for example, or a new ISP come on board early, so much the better. We're going to capture the details of this and put it out there in our guidance. Now, this guidance on early connection has particular status. So it's what we call have regards to status, which means that trustees really have to follow this guidance unless they've got a good reason not to follow it. So it sits in between standards and ordinary guidance as well. So it's got a bit more sort of legal weight, and we think that's important because of the uniformity here that we have to be able to sort of process these applications with. And then so coming on to process applications. So yes, you will have to make an application, but there is the possibility for bulk applications, which we recognise will be facilitative. But with all applications, there is the possibility that we might not grant any. Now, we start from the position that we're minded to grant all the applications that come through, unless we think it's going to cause some capacity crunch here for us. And then what we will do is we'll give priority to those occupational pension schemes that are already sort of connected using existing endpoints, because that's an easier process. And then we have to sort of sift it sort of one way or the other. So we will focus on then the larger schemes measured by number of relevant members, to get as many on board as possible. There's also one other circumstance, which I'll touch upon in a second, which is as part of this process, we have to consult with TPR. I'll mention that in the next slide. So I think that's everything covered on this slide, Caroline. So we move on to the next slide. Thank you. On this slide, I'm talking about more exactly what the process is. So 3 elements here. The first element is that we have to consult with TPR, the pensions regulator, that is, whenever we receive an application for early connection. Very keen to sort of smooth this process as much as possible. And the reason for consulting with TPR, by the way, is just to ensure that they have sufficient regulatory capacity for this whenever the scheme is onboarded as well. So it's just a check-in with them. And because it's just check-in, we're trying to sort of speed this process up as much as possible. And we're going to put in place an arrangement with TPR where they're going to indicate when they would like us to consult with them. So hopefully, for the most part, we won't need to, because they'll say, providing it's within these parameters, we're okay. But we have to think about the time needed to consult with TPR and the time to process these early connections. So we have had to sort of stipulate the minimum period within which an applicant must send the application in to us, and we think that's 2 months, and we think that's the proposal, 2 months before their scheme's effective staging window would open, and that gives us sufficient time, a couple of weeks, to get in touch with TPR, consult with them, deal with any issues that might arise, 2 to 3 weeks, maybe close to 3 weeks, and then also for us to undertake our process as well. As James said earlier, we're being a little bit prudent with some of these sort of timetables and deadlines, and if we can do it quicker, of course we will do it quicker, or so more quickly. The third element, so covered, the TPR element, the timing for the application. Third element is actually the effect of the application, and we're really looking for applications that will effectively move the staging date by a month for those with an existing staging date. And we don't think that's too much, but we have to have some sort of threshold by which it's worthwhile us and TPR engaging sort of resource to process early connections. So the proposal is come to us at least 2 months before your window would open under your application, and actually an application that brings forward the time by a month. And so we think that looking at TPR's guidance, this should be manageable, because they're really suggesting that schemes start to think about their staging date well over a year in advance. So if you're following TPR's guidance, you should have plenty of time then to prepare and come to us early, and you can come to us even earlier than the 2 months prior. That's just the minimum. So we put out the proposals in that document, and in the early connection guidance, and we're asking 2 questions because it's a very sort of discrete issue. And the first is, do you consider the notification requirements to be reasonable? And also, and that's 2 months. And also, do you consider the month requirement, and that's a month for moving your staging date as a minimum? Please consider that to be reasonable. So really interested in the industry's thoughts and feedback on both those issues, and pick them up and send them through to us. So that's my bit finished. I'm going to hand back to Richard now, who's going to chair the Q&A. Over to you, Richard.
Superb, thank you, Gary, and thank you, James. So I hope that's given you all a bit of a helpful overview of the draft standards and guidance documents that concern connection to the ecosystem. We've now got an opportunity for you to ask any questions, and we'll provide any further explanations that you need and answers to help you engage with materials, respond to our consultation. And of course, I will be leaning on James and Gary as we go through that process to provide a lot of the technical expertise to answer any of those questions that you might have. So as ever, please do capture those questions in the question box if you haven't already done so. And we'll start with a couple of questions that have come in that I think help to draw out some of the distinction between some of those methods of connection that you heard about, and particularly whether you choose to connect via an ISP or directly. So James, I'll ask you to pick up on a couple of these questions. And the first of those is about, as a third-party administrator who will be subscribing via an ISP, some of the content in here seems less relevant to those who might than it would be for those who might choose to connect directly. Is that right? And on a linked note, we've also been asked, what sort of lead time might there be for those who choose to connect via an ISP? So those are clearly 2 very different approaches. James, could you perhaps come in and give a view on those?
Yes, sure, Richard. So we do expect most pension providers to be connecting via third parties, such as ISPs. and the implementation of these standards will be undertaken by third parties who are connecting to the ecosystem on their behalf, rather than the scheme connecting directly themselves. However, as a regulated entity to whom the standards apply, the schemes will still be accountable for their compliance, but the third parties would be doing the connecting and implementing for them. So it is, I think it's popped into one of the answers, we recommend all parties being familiar with these standards. However, the technical detail is probably relevant to the connecting party. And with regard to the 30 days, we think 30 days should be a reasonable window to allow people to connect. I think for a third party who is already connected to the ecosystem, then it shouldn't take too long for you to complete your registration and to connect. What that does mean is, but for anyone but the first cohort of pension providers, you will need to come to PDP ahead of your connection window, since the legislation gives you a window of a month. That allows us the 30 days to connect you. But hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you, James. Yeah, so it's certainly worth everybody thinking about if you are a scheme or an administrator. It's certainly easier to connect via an ISP, and the timelines will look a little different. So that's something for you to think about when formulating your approach to how you want to go about doing this. Super. So let's move on to another question that we have had in. And actually, it's on a similar note. So as a third-party pensions administrator, in this case with 30 schemes, do we register as a pensions provider once or 30 times? So James, I'll come to you on that one as well, please.
Yeah, sure. So if you're connecting multiple clients, you'll need to register as a data provider connecting to the ecosystem. So therefore, you would only go through testing, service acceptance, transition to live only once. What you then need to do is subsequently just register pension providers connecting via your connection. So, for example, if you're a pension provider with 30 schemes, what you do is connect once. You would register 30 schemes, but it is quite a very straightforward process to simply add those additional schemes on.
Super. Thank you, James. Gary, I'm going to come to you with the next one. So this one's about early connection. And it's probably an observation as much as a question, but we've been asked, until you operationalize this, then it's quite difficult to answer the consultation questions. Gary, do you want to offer a few thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and I think it's a really fair question as well, and it probably just doesn't apply to sort of early connection, applies across the board. So what we've done in the approach here is we try to develop all of our proposals with industry as well as our stakeholder partners to come up with what we believe to be the best starting position. And these are just proposals which we're sending out to the industry for consultation. So we can start in absolutely the best place. So we're really looking for sort of feedback here, because it is artificial until we start to sort of see real life experience, but we want to start in that sort of best position as possible. And just finally, all of our standards and guidance is capable of revision later on as well. And in the first webinar, which I sort of recommend people go back and listen to that, Richard and Chris were able to cover how we would sort of revise standards and guidance to take account of experience and changes as well, but caution that we wouldn't do that too frequently because that'd be sort of disruptive. So hopefully that sort of helps.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think our intention is to give everybody as much information as early as we can in all of this process, and that's really what underpins the early connection side of things. This is one of those areas where I'm certain we will learn more as we go along. As Gary said, we may update and revise things, but we're looking to set out as much as we can for you as early as possible so that you can plan with certainty. And so look, continuing with that early connection theme, Gary, we've also been asked, will we be publishing when we will choose to consult with TPR on that early connection?
Yeah, well, this is something we're discussing sort of actively with TPR. In the first place, we're going to be discussing the actual circumstances when we consult with them, and we need to sort of resolve that. And we'll do that over the next couple of months. We're raising and actively discussing the issue of publication. No decision has been sort of made yet. Ideally, we come from a position, as is TPR, we'd like to be as sort of transparent as possible. But I think the focus should be on what those sort of circumstances for consultation aren't, and then we sort of really actively consider publication after that.
Thank you, Gary. James, we'll come back to you for a moment. We've been asked, why are we proposing a response time of under 2 seconds to return the value information? And I think there's recognition in the question. This makes it really hard to calculate real-time values and requires the data provider to have a data lake already uploaded, and therefore perhaps not the very most up-to-date calculations available. So, James, would you like to offer a few thoughts on that 2-second response time?
Yes, sure, Richard. So we're proposing 2 seconds or under because we're prioritizing a fast response for consumers and therefore a good user experience. However, we are very keen to understand whether this will create a barrier to calculating real-time values. So we have asked a question on this in our consultation. We're very keen to get views on that. Obviously we have taken the approach of having a data lake of uploaded data and therefore periodic bulk calculations. But for those that are looking at real time, we'd be very keen to understand what sort of service level would suit them.
Super. Thank you, James. Let's keep going. So the next question is, thanks all for a very helpful session. Great to have that feedback. Thank you. And it looks like huge progress is being made. Naturally, we agree. The DWP's recent consultation response refers to a pension link, which would allow, for example, a trust scheme's AVC providers to connect to the data, the central architecture via a separate endpoint. Do the draft standards or guidance give any more detail on this point, which is likely to be relevant to many occupational schemes? Gary, can I come to you for that one?
Yeah, this is an area that we've worked on quite a bit over the last year, engaged with industry, and so it is an area that we are providing more detail. But the reason why I love this question is because I don't necessarily need to answer, because I can trail webinar 3, because the answer is in our data standards and data usage guidance, where we're outlining the process for that sort of pensions link there. And so more detail will be provided on this one by Chris Connolly in webinar 3. So hopefully that's a plug. You have to sort of tune in for webinar 3 to answer that one in more detail from the expert.
Brilliant, thank you, Gary. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Hopefully, most of you have already signed up for webinar 3, and if you're not, we'd encourage you to do so. There's some really good, interesting stuff in there. So the next question that we've been asked is picking up on that 1 week to 30-day lead time for connection via a third party again. And the question is, could that lead data providers to leave decisions a little late? Wouldn't good governance suggest they should have a longer lead time to ensure proper diligence for connections and contracts with ISP? Now, I'm happy to pick up this one myself, actually, because this is a subject that is very, very dear to my heart. You won't be surprised. I am keen to encourage very early action from everybody who needs to be ready to connect to the dashboard's ecosystem. That 1 week to 30-day lead time is about literally the task of connecting and completing the tasks associated with that when you are using a third-party provider. It is not the total amount of time that you're going to need in order to prepare your scheme and your data and enter into commercial relationships with an ISP, for example, in order to complete this. So I would really, really strongly encourage all pension schemes administrators to already be thinking now about how you want to go about connecting. Looking at what we're seeing is starting to become quite an active emerging market of potential ISP providers, and start thinking about which ones you want to work with, which ones are the best fit for your scheme and for your business, because that 30 days really is just about the mechanics of completing the activity to connect. You've got an awful lot to think about ahead of that, and I absolutely agree with the question asker here. That work needs to start now, because there's an awful lot to do to get yourselves ready and connected to the dashboard's ecosystem. So please do look at the material we're publishing here. Gives you a lot of really good insight about the stuff you will need to do in order to get ready, and start taking those steps, doing that thinking now about how you're going to connect, who you're going to connect through, if you want to use that third party, and getting your scheme ready to meet its obligations in due course. So we've
jump in again. I should be on commission for making shameless plugs here, but so we've outlined not just our steps to connection, but the pensions regulator for those occupational pension schemes. They've put out guidance about a month ago, which I think is being updated. But what they set out are the steps to connection, which are the steps that schemes should be taking 12-15 months out from connection. Just very much building on the theme that Richard did you outline there about how this should be a sort of well-planned, sort of detailed step towards connection, and not any sort of rush towards the end. So that very much not just where we're coming from, but actually the regulators as well. Underpinned by good governance to achieve the right outcome.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Gary. Completely agree. James, I'll come to you with the next one. So we're being asked, do we know what testing is going to be needed around the ecosystem from August of next year through to the dashboard's available point, with a sense that that might affect people's planning based on what kind of testing is going to be needed there? James, can I come to you for thoughts on that one?
So there's a few things there. So depending on whether you're a dashboard or data provider, we have the integration and testing working group, which you become a member of when you commence connecting to the dashboard's ecosystem. And within that, we will take you through the planning that's required, or the planned testing that's required. Dashboard's available point. Apologies if I sound like I'm on an airfield. I don't know where that came from. But in terms of testing to the dashboard's available point, obviously continuing planning is ongoing, and we'll communicate that with any providers as soon as we have it.
Thank you, James. And yes, I think there was an aircraft flying low over here, so apologies for that, everybody. Next question that I'll point to you, Gary, is the PDP's expectation that contract between trustees and ISPs and administrators would require the ISPs and administrators to comply with the detail of standards and statutory guidance? And essentially, I think that's about giving trustees the reassurance as to the parties who are ultimately liable for compliance with those standards. Gary, thoughts on that one, please?
Yeah, I think that is. I think not to lose sight of the fact that it is the trustees and the managers of the scheme who are sort of liable here for compliance with these standards. So if they're like any other activity, if you're contracting with a service provider to carry out your obligations, you've got to make sure that they know what those obligations are and they're carrying them out. The best way to do that is through a contract with a third-party service provider, and that's consistent with also what the pension regulator has said. But just actually putting in place the contract is not enough. There's a degree of sort of oversight requirements. So I think that's also what the regulator is suggesting, that there should be some monitoring and oversight and reporting as well. So the trustees and managers have that ongoing assurance that their service provider is sort of meeting those obligations. So,
thank you, Gary. Next question returns back to the 2 seconds response time that we touched on earlier. So James, I'll come back to you on this one. And that's, do you think that the 2 seconds for return of view data might be overly optimistic and prescriptive? I think we'll file this one under leading questions, but James, a few thoughts on that one.
I'm not sure on overly optimistic. certainly the ecosystem has been created with that sort of timescale in mind. The purpose of the consultation is to obviously gather views on that and understand what people think the barriers would be. And I think this possibly then leads back to things like real-time calculations. And if you feel that 2 seconds is not realistic, then please do feed that back. What we are trying to keep in mind is the user experience here. I'm sure everyone, particularly dashboard providers, would like their users to have the best possible experience, and waiting for return of view data. Obviously, the longer that goes on, the less of a positive experience it is. So we do need to find some sort of sweet spot, if you like, to ensure that we have that positive experience versus, we take into account the complexities of returning that data.
Yeah, thanks, James. And I would just add to that to say, I think this is another illustration of why that really early thinking about how to connect and working with potential ISPs is really, really important for schemes on all of this, because essentially this is the kind of conversation that you'll need to be having around what you might need to do to ensure that your data is able to support that sort of response time, because all of our user testing tells us that is really, really important, that people get that view data quickly, and that you can therefore take the steps to ensure that your data is fit to work with that integrated service provider, or as obviously to connect yourselves, so that you can furnish the data within that time frame. But it is important. But as James says, we are looking to hear views on what might make that difficult during the course of this consultation. So please do make sure you share your thoughts with us on that one. Okay, so moving on, you mentioned adding multiple schemes as a data provider will be an easy process. What's the process for registering? James, can I come to you on that one as well, please?
Sure. So we're currently trialing the onboard process with our alpha participants. Onboarding will be carried out via the Salesforce platform, and it's a relatively straightforward process. There's certain obviously information that would be required as a data provider to connect. Obviously, the reason for that is when you're first connecting as a scheme endpoint, you're connecting a closed, secure ecosystem, and there's quite a number of checks and balances we need to do to ensure that we only let the right people in. Once that connection is made, the process of adding multiple schemes, effectively what you're doing is just adding more data at your end that's available to find requests and view requests. So from an onboarding perspective, what you would be submitting to us is information about the particular scheme that you are onboarding, so that we can ensure that they've met their obligations in terms of connecting. But you won't be going through the full technical process of all of the information and the testing that's required to connect the endpoint. So it is relatively straightforward. It is a couple of pages on Salesforce to just add that additional information.
Thanks very much, James. So a relatively straightforward one here. I think when we say pension provider level connection, is that at FCA firm reference level? Some firms or providers have multiple entities still. James, if I can ask you again just to pick up on that one.
Yes, sure. So pension provider level connection. So what we try and split it down is obligated entities. So those that are obligated either via TPR or FCA to connect, they may connect directly, or they may have someone do it on their behalf. And that person doing it on their behalf may be a company that's created in order to do that, such as an ISP, or it may be a pensions administrator who has a connection. But certainly from a connected entity, from a obligated entity level, that is at the FCA or TPR level.
Super, thank you, James. We are reverting here again to a little bit of the questioning about the balance between the scheme administrator and the ISP with this question. So when the scheme is connected to the dashboard via an ISP, who will be liable in respect of any failures to meet the ongoing adherence to the MAP standards? or if the connection to the dashboard goes down. And the questioner just goes on to expand on that. So the regulators expect 24/7 connection to the dashboard. Failure to meet the standards or keep a stable connection to the dashboard can result in fines or regulatory enforcement. Who will be liable for any of those fines from the regulator for any loss of connection to the dashboard for whatever reason? James, I'll ask you to pick up on that as well. I think we sort of touched on some of this, but just to reiterate some of the messaging around the balance. Perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, I think Gary covered some of this, but certainly what, to reiterate what Gary said, as the obligated entity, it is your connection to the dashboard program. However, we would expect, as part of good contracting and certainly reputable ISPs who will be operating in the ecosystem, you would be agreeing what liabilities there would be between the two. And also, taking a step back from that, one of the reasons for things like us going through this consultation and saying that people should be familiar with the standards is so that you can be an informed consumer if you are looking at an ISP, because it's very important to ensure that they can commit to the service levels.
Thank you, James.
Richard,
Gary.
come in there. Yeah. So just to build, so what James was talking about, just add a couple of points. The regulators will be publishing their approach to enforcement, later on in the year as well. So certainly TPR and then FCA will be explaining their approach as part of their consultation. So look out for that. And what we've talked about is direct liability under the legislation for trustees and managers if their obligations aren't undertaken. Who would enforce would be the regulators. So that's why the enforcement policy is so important. But as I mentioned earlier, if there's a contractual relationship between the trustees and managers of the schemes and a third-party provider, and they don't comply with their contractual provisions, then there is a potential contractual liability between that service provider to their client, the trustee managers as well. So that's why it's so important to have a good contract in place that if the trustees or managers are exposed because of the failures of their third parties, service providers, then that exposure is mitigated by that contractual provision that's in place. So that's why it's really important to look at your contracts, make sure they're as tight as possible, and get input from your lawyers there.
Thank you, Gary. Really helpful clarification, and another reason why it's so important to start thinking about all of this very early. Right, James, we'll come to you with the next one. So if a fine request is missed due to scheduled or unscheduled downtime, is there an expectation that it will be served when service is restored? And if not, will the person searching be informed which providers didn't respond? So James, to you for that one, please, about how the architecture will handle that.
Sure. So if we are talking in the case of unscheduled downtime, so we would, as part of the ecosystem, expect some queuing of messages. Typically, I think the period is 2 to 3 hours. Obviously, if you then go outside of that, then those find requests would obviously not be saved, and they are certainly not saved on the ecosystem side, as we do not save any data. That is one of the main reasons, I think, for the standards in place in terms of notifying us of scheduled or unscheduled downtime, so that we can manage people's expectations in terms of find requests and whether they've been served or not. We're still working through that. The one thing I can say is that the ecosystem would not support kind of real-time messaging for updates for every find request in terms of when it was received, whether a pension's been found, whether it was not acknowledged, etc. Just given the sheer volume of information and API calls we'd be making. So what we're trying to do is come up with some innovative ways that we can inform users if, for example, a find request has been unsuccessful.
Thank you, James. It's probably worth explicitly referencing that the service standards are setting out that after 3 retry attempts by the architecture, that's when your endpoint will be deemed to be down. And then after that retry failure, you need to restore that service within 2 hours and process any backlog at that point. So that's quite explicit in the standards. And again, we'll be looking for your thoughts on that as you respond to the consultation. Last question that we got, and that's probably a good thing, we're just running out of time now, running into the last few minutes of the session. How will compliance with requirements such as response times be monitored? So will PDP inform schemes or ISPs if they're failing to meet those standards, or will this be left to TPR? Gary, can I come to you on that one, please?
Yeah, sure, thanks. I thought this one was coming to me. So we're not the PDP isn't a regulator. We're here to build the central digital architecture and the ecosystem, and as part of our functions here, we're putting in place reporting standards. So I can answer and refer to the reporting standards to answer the question, but also make another plug, because Helen Scrimgeour, your colleague, will be talking about the content of the reporting standards in detail in webinar 3. But what the reporting standards are those requirements imposed on what we call obligated entities, so your dashboards, your pension schemes, to report to us on some compliance issues. And actually, we'll be picking up some compliance issues ourselves. What we do, especially for response times, is we'll be passing that information over to the regulators for them to sort of assess, and it'll be ultimately for the regulators then to decide when and how they go back to their respective regulated entity to pick up any sort of non-compliance. We won't be doing that for the most part, because we're not a regulator. Sometimes, and it's not on response times, there might be some issues with the connection, and where we come across that, we might get in touch with the scheme or the dashboard and say, look, there's this issue with connection. Do you want to try and fix it before it becomes a problem? To be sort of helpful there. But for the most part, we'll be passing all this information over to the regulators for them to sift through, and for them to take that sort of their regulatory action, sort of scrutiny, potentially lead to regulatory action after that. So I think that's me finished on that one.
Richard, can you check if you're on mute?
I do apologise. I was absolutely on mute there. So talking to myself. So look, thank you very much, everybody, for joining and participating in that webinar. Please do join us again for the next third webinar, which is tomorrow. And that's where we'll be looking at the draft standards and guidance relating to operating within the ecosystem. That includes the call for input on the design standards for dashboards, the draft data standards for pension providers, and the draft reporting standards for both dashboards and pension providers. So please do join us for that, and make sure you're engaging with those consultation materials and responding to our consultation. Quick reminder of that timeline. You can see we're currently at that second point on the timeline where we are consulting on our draft standards following the government's final policy position set out in the consultation response on the regulations. The key date to remember in all of this is the consultation closing date is the 30th of August. Again, as we said last time, we do recognise that's difficult timing over the summer, but we are really keen to share this information with you as early as possible and provide you with certainty at the earliest possible stage to help you get dashboards ready. Following the consultation, we will finalise the standards, and then we will consult on the draft dashboard design standards in the autumn. And then once the legislation is in place, which always is subject to parliamentary time, but we expect that to be around sort of November, December time, we will then publish the very final standards, other than those dashboard design standards, which will follow. So that is all that we've got for you today. Thank you very much indeed for your participation and those really, really good, helpful questions. I found that really, really useful and helpful to see those questions coming in. And I will look forward to seeing you at tomorrow's Dashboards webinar as well. For now, thank you very much. Please do stay in touch. You can find lots more information on the program's website or on our LinkedIn or Twitter. But for now, thank you. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.